Good morning, everyone. So this morning, you guys know why we're here. We're going to have a presentation about redlining in the city of Cleveland. Our presentation is coming to us from the Cleveland Neighborhood Progress. It's a nonprofit in the city of Cleveland, and they are doing wonderful things with this. They have an exhibit in the city of Cleveland, and unfortunately, we couldn't take all of you guys down to the exhibit, but they were gracious enough to bring a representative here and share with us some of the information that they have in the exhibit. So I won't try to explain what he's going to do. I'll let him explain himself. But our presenter today is named Devontae Dickey, and he's going to talk to us and share pictures and everything. So hopefully you guys will learn a lot. It'll be insightful. And if you're in the sociology class, make sure you're paying close attention, because you never know if a question pops up on the quiz or the midterm from what we're watching today, okay? So without further ado, I give you Devontae Dickey.
Good morning, everyone. Oh, wow, okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to give off some of my very overzealous energy. It's early. I know that we all are drinking our coffees and whatnot, so I'm going to try my best to exude as much energy as possible. Thank you so much, Professor Stark, for the marvelous introduction. My name is Devontae Dickey. I serve as the Advocacy and Engagement Coordinator for Cleveland Neighborhood Progress. By any chance, is anyone familiar with the organization? No problem. So Cleveland Neighborhood Progress, we are a 31-year-old community development funding intermediary, simply meaning that we receive resources from the philanthropic sector, so the George Gunn Foundation, the Cleveland Foundation, the St. Luke's Foundation, as well as several others. They give us resources, and then we service that middleman, that liaison, to then re-grant those resources to about 27 community development corporations, also known as CDCs. So of course, in each and every neighborhood in Cleveland, you will most likely find a community development corporation, also known as a CDC. And each of those CDCs work on a panoply of issues. One can be working on, climate and resiliency efforts. Another could be working on land acquisition. Another one can be working on amplifying civic engagement. So all in all, each of their issues pertaining to their respective communities varies. But of course, the purpose of today is to talk about a body of work that we have been cultivating called Undesign the Redline, particularly around the topic of redlining itself. But before we dive into that, I want to first provide a little bit of background information about my work and my work. So first and foremost, you probably saw the title and was like, oh, civic engagement, how does this relate to redlining? But the bulk of my work, especially in the efforts pertaining to 2020, the 2020 elections, the 2020 census, is around this body of work called Cleveland Votes. So Cleveland Votes is a nonpartisan democracy initiative under the guise and currently housed in Cleveland Neighborhood Progress to talk about what does it mean to exercise your civic duty through and through. So not exercise your duty every 2 years or every 4 years, but instead understand that we need to be exercising our civic duty each and every day. And with that is a matter of us building that civic muscle. The quote that you will see is from the Kerwin Institute at Ohio State University, and this is more so our philosophy pertaining to our Cleveland Votes work, and the quote reads as follows. Fundamentally, equitable civic engagement is about leveraging the power dynamics of a place, giving voice to those previously alienated and excluded from the civic process. So of course, I'm going to spend time throughout this presentation talking about the systemic, institutionalized, and structural ways in which a lot of communities have been alienated and ostracized in more ways than one. And one of the ways you see it is through the civic process, unfortunately. The second body of work that I work on in tandem with Undesign the Redline, which I will get to momentarily, is around another initiative called Hack Cleveland. So Hack Cleveland is a civic tech initiative that is built around utilizing civic technology to combat social injustices. So after the unfortunate killing of Tamir Rice, the co-founders of Hack Cleveland came together and said, hey, we may not want to be those people protesting out on the streets, but instead we just want to be on the sidelines passing out water bottles and passing out sandwiches. And that within itself is still yet another form of advocacy work. So with that, they realized that, hey, in order for us to continue to shift this paradigm, why not use technology in order to combat those social injustices? So some of the bodies of work that we've done with Hack Cleveland is, of course, having a hackathon, as we love to say, having computer programmers and computer science majors come in, drink Red Bull, and try to crank out an app within like 12 hours, which is great. The second one, but in our after hosting our hackathon, we realized that there was unfortunately not a lot of sustainability post that event. Like, you will have the apps developed, but there was no one there to further develop it into its fruition. So with that, we decided to spend, in 2018, time to build out something called a Scopathon. So is anyone familiar with a Scopathon? No. Okay, boom, no problem. So a Scopathon is pretty much the ability to say, hey, let's take this very convoluted, very complex issue, and let's just stop and break it down into to its various parts. So the topic that the issue in the system that we tackled was the criminal justice system. And if you are familiar with the criminal justice system, you know it is quite convoluted, very complex, and there's no way you can expect technologists to come in and within a 48-hour time period and develop an app, because you don't even know the context of what you're trying to what the app is supposed to do. So of course we spent a day and a half developing the Scopathon, which pretty much broke into three various parts. We broke down this topic of the criminal justice system into bail reform, skill alignment, and acknowledgement, and cash bailout. And simply having technologists, those who have engaged with the criminal justice system, community residents, and anyone else who was just interested, to break out into these dynamic groups and develop an app pertaining to one of those issues, as opposed to developing an app for the entire system itself. And of course, with that, we are working with Microsoft to further develop those apps as well, which is great. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, for the last 4 years, my organization, Cleveland Neighborhood Progress, as well as another entity, my comrades at Third Space Action Lab, Evelyn Burnett and Mordecai Cargill, as well as my phenomenal other comrade, Erica Anthony, the three of them in 2016 came together and said, hey, we need to acknowledge the systemic, historical, and structural racism that unfortunately exists in our country. And if we, in fact, want to build a much more racially equitable society, we need to first do something called awareness building. So of course they brought in the Racial Equity Institute, which is these monthly trainings for the last 4 years. That is a groundwork training, so it's a 3.5-hour training, as well as a phase 1 training, which is a 2-day training to talk about the history of institutionalized, structural, and historical racism. And once again, you go through these trainings and you now have the acumen, you now have the knowledge, at least at the beginning, to continue to do that awareness building and to learn all of the ways that racism has unfortunately still permeated in our country. So of course, with that, we are glad to say that more than 5,000 people have gone through those two training. But of course, after each and every training, as I love to say, has anyone seen The Matrix? One of my favorite movies, The Matrix. So at the beginning of the movie, one of the characters give Neo's the blue pill or the red pill, and it's pretty much, if you want to learn about the Matrix, the real world, the real elements of our society, take this pill to see, aka the Matrix. You take the Matrix, you may take the Matrix. You take the pill, and boom, you now get to see the true realities, the true inequities in our country. And so that is what we're constantly challenging people to do. You go through these two training, and you've now taken this red pill, and you've now seen the Matrix. So of course, the number one question is, what can I do next? Oh, I've now learned about this. I'm now aka in the Matrix. So what do I do? And oftentimes we always challenge people to say, if we have the 10 steps to eradicating racism, I will be out in Broadway, I will be out trying to pursue a Grammy, I will be out on a beach. But unfortunately, the 10 steps towards eradicating racism does not exist. So of course, that requires us to continue our knowledge and continue that awareness building. And that is why we decided to introduce the Undesign the Redline exhibit. So the Undesign the Redline exhibit is this very interactive exhibition that talks about the history of redlining, and I will delve into the details, or rather expound on what redlining is momentarily. But we're happy to announce that more than 4,000 people have gone through it within a 2-year time span. So many institutions and organizations have engaged with it, and people are also, continuing to do that awareness building, which is great. So I know it's early, and I want to commend you all for joining us in this effort to literally undesign the red line. So let's start. Icebreaker, because I see a lot of lackadaisical faces. I'm gonna try to give up as much energy as possible. Icebreaker. So, what do you see, hear, and do in your community? And by all means, I want this to be very casual. By all means, so if you would like to raise your hand and say what is it that you do, hear, or even see in your community, that would be great. Anyone? I call on people, y'all.
Well, I work here at Cuyahoga College. And I also run our writing workshop.
Okay. Nice.
People, so I see and hear a lot of different voices.
Nice,
I meet
nice.
a lot of
Nice. Thank you. Yes.
So I am an advocate for chronic kidney disease. So how I found out about the exhibit because I go to Mount Pleasant Community Center
Mm-hmm.
and I set up tables and talk to people in the community about the importance of taking care of their diabetes,
Absolutely.
hypertension, to avoid getting chronic kidney disease. I talk about the symptoms
Mhm.
and early stages
Absolutely.
and know where everyone asks. So
Perfect. Thank you. How about one more? Anyone? Come on, anyone? That's fine. So, if you are familiar with the city of Cleveland, I don't think it's anything new that there are a panoply of issues that unfortunately is in our city. Of course, some of these issues include safety, crime, pollution, asthma, lead poisoning, underfunded schools through via CMSD, mortality, infant mortality, environmental injustices, contaminated houses or housing, no internet access, no transportation, public health issues as well as health issues, discrimination to obtain housing, gentrification, hair discrimination, liquor lining, even a panoply of corner stores, and of course, lastly, my passion, which is eradicating voter and census oppression, aka civic oppression, civic suppression. So of course, throughout this presentation, I'm going to be taking the time to not only provide you the social historical context of redlining, but also give you the contemporary elements, the contemporary ramifications of it. So in other words, you're learning about the 1930s history, but you're also getting to understand how we are seeing this in our everyday lives. And of course, I will be remiss to, and throughout this time, I will also be suggesting a lot of books. I love books. I love to consume information. So the first one that I'm going to emphasize is this book called New Power by Jeremy Hyman's. And the reason why I'm introducing this book right now is because the authors talk about how we are living in this hyper-connected society. In other words, we are shifting from old power, which was categorized as a me/I mentality. Once you obtain this information, you want to keep it to yourself. The number one example of that is wealth, or education. Once you obtain it, you want to keep it to yourself, and you don't want to share it. However, because of the hyper-connected society that we are now living in, the phase of the era of new power. And new power is deemed as a surge. Once you obtain this information, you now want to share it with everyone in your community. In other words, it is collective edification. And so another reason why I mention this is because I love to emphasize that I am no expert in this topic. I want this to be a two-way dialogue. Of course, there are going to be a lot of information that I'm sharing, but if there's anything that you want to share, by all means, please raise your hand and share with the community, with this space. So of course, back to the challenges pertaining to Cleveland. Once again, when we talk about these challenges, oftentimes we're analyzing them, you tend to compartmentalize and only analyze it through that particular lens, as opposed to understanding how they are all highly interconnected and the intersectionalities of them. So of course, let's begin by talking about the synergy, which is redlining. So has anyone ever heard of the term redlining? And if so, would someone like to define what it is? Yes. Heard of it? Raise your hand. Okay, come on, raise your hands high. Come on, let's get that blood circulation. Okay, would anyone like to attempt or would like to, in fact, define what it is? Mm-hmm. 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 absolutely. I'm sorry, what is your name, sir? Wai Wang. Can we give it up for Wai Wang? Come on. Yes, yes, yes. Yes, yes. Yes, sir.
I was about to redlining is the idea that my feeling is like it's combined
Precisely. And I'm sorry, what is your name, sir? Evan. Can we give it up for Evan, too? Yes, yes. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And once again, I want this to be very casual. This is a very when we tend to talk about this topic, it tends to be instantaneous. A lot of people tend to, the topic tends to be instantaneously doom and gloom. So I want to ensure that we are taking the time to be engaged and to be active in this conversation. So thank you so much for the beautiful definitions. So of course, as I love to say, I love music, so I love to incorporate contemporary information as it relates to redlining. So is anyone familiar with Beyonce and Jay-Z? Jay-Z? Like, boom, okay, great, come on. So I'm sure you all know this song. I can't say the song because we are recording right now, but you all know the song. But you see these two lines that they talk about. And Beyonce and Jay-Z sing / raps, give me my check, put some respect on my check, or pay me in equity. And the two words that I emphasize that you will see are bolded is check and equity. And there's a reason why I emphasize that. Because at this point, they're talking about the dichotomy between disposable income, which is AKA checks, versus what it means to build wealth, what it means to have equity, what it means to be able to have something or assets that you can then give to your children, your grandchildren, and so forth. Because once again, those are two totally different things. So when we're talking about economics, when we're talking about money, we need to be very clear about what form of assets and what form of liabilities are we discussing. So of course, the reason why I talk about this is because one of the greatest ways that we have built, one of the greatest assets rather, that you can have in order to build equity, in order to build wealth and generational wealth, is by being a homeowner. And of course, due to de jure segregation, due to these discriminatory practices, policies, and procedures administrated by our federal government, it has become increasingly difficult for minorities to have access to equity building and to have that ability to generate wealth and generational wealth. So that is why I wanted to emphasize what Jay-Z and Beyonce are singing / rapping about. So now let's go back to the 1930s. This is one of the definitions, for redlining. The illegal practice of refusing to offer credit and insurance in a particular community on the discriminatory basis as because of the race or ethnicity of its residents. And of course, this is only one of the definitions. When I say, although the genesis of redlining started, the nucleus was solely about insurance and credit and loans, of course, the societal ramifications tended to go into mobility, transportation, health problems, a panoply of issues that we will discuss in a second. So of course, you will see on this map, you will see one of the 1939 Cleveland redlining map. But before we even get to that, I'm going to first explain a little bit of the history. So is anyone familiar, actually I'm going to post a question. What was happening in the late 1930s? I'm sorry? Not yet, not quite. Yes, no, not yet, but thank you. Boom, the Great Depression. So the Great Depression took place, and our economy was completely in shambles. And so at that point, the president of the time, President Roosevelt, decided to implement something called the New Deal. Is anyone familiar with the New Deal? The New Deal, yes, boom. The New Deal was more so $1 trillion. In today's time, of course, the dollars are inflated to represent 2020, but more than $1 trillion were reinvested back into our economy. And these included a series of programs, one of the most famous one being Social Security. And the point of these programs was to not only restabilize our economy, but also create job creation, but more importantly, allow people to own homes. And so with that, in the development or the passing of the New Deal programs was something called the National Housing Act of 1934. And if there's anything that I want you to remember in today's presentation, it is that piece of legislation and how that pretty much created what we now know as the 30-year mortgage. So if you are a homeowner, you typically go to a bank, you request the loan, they give you the loan to a home loan, and then you spend 30 years paying your mortgage to pay off that loan. However, when you take the time, or when you apply a racial equity lens to that piece of legislation, you tend to realize that it was actually built upon discriminatory practices. They didn't want minorities to have the ability to own homes, and they wanted it to be increasingly easier for our melanin deficient, as I love to say, individuals to go out and to obtain those homes at a significantly cheaper price. So of course, at this point, we're now seeing the incubation, the discrepancies between those being able to generate that wealth and those who cannot. Fast forward, you now have something called the Homeowner Loan Corporation, the HOLC. Oh yeah, I have some, thank you. The HOLC's job was to go out and to audit more than 239 metropolitan areas and create, AKA, these security maps. First, for banking institutions. And these security maps were for banks to say, hey, where are the areas where it would be a risk for us to approve a mortgage, and what are the areas where we should, in fact, give out mortgages and emphasize and help with economic development. So of course, you then have you have more than 239 security maps. These security maps were codified in 4 different colors. The first one is green, which was deemed as desirable. The second one, which was blue, was deemed as still desirable. And I'm going to pause right there because, to be quite frank, those are your very racially homogenous neighborhoods. Those are your rocky rivers. Those are your Beechwoods, your Pepper Pipes. I think we all know those. We know those areas, and they are just thriving communities. Juxtapose, you then have the yellow lined areas, which were deemed as declining, and then lastly, hence the name, redlining. And the redlining neighborhoods or communities were deemed as hazardous. It was almost like a war zone. It was literally a place. It was almost like an infection. It was an area that you did not want to engage with, because had you lived in that neighborhood, there would be no way, or it will be increasingly difficult for you to gain that upward mobility and aka achieve the American dream. Yes. I'm sorry. So this is the 1939 Cleveland redlining / security map. Thank you so much. And of course, people love to ask why some of the other areas are not color-coded. One, simply it was just undeveloped. Secondly, it was agricultural, and then just other, like nuances of just simply not being developed at the time. Or commercial, I'm sorry. So hence why you do not see downtown Cleveland being color-coded, because it was obviously a commercial area. So of course, the second question after people talk about this is like, how did this happen? And at this point, we love to talk about what are some of the mechanisms that were utilized to exacerbate and to materialize this practice of redlining itself. So of course, as I mentioned before, we're talking about this $1 trillion. And the number one question that I always pose is $1 trillion for whom exactly? So of course, you have, once again, the 1939, the National Housing Act of 1934 being created. You have the Social Security and Social Administrations being created once again to further help and to further materialize this practice of redlining. But there were also some other repugnant practices that took place as well. And some that I want to talk about are the following. Excuse me. Excuse me 1 second, because I know I have it. So boom. So the 4 that I want to talk about are contract buying / land contracts, planned shrinkage, block busting, and then lastly, predatory banking. We're going to first start off with block busting. Is anyone familiar with the term block busting? Would you like to define what it is? Boom. Perfect. And I'm sorry, what is your name, ma'am?
I'm Sarah.
Sarah, thank you. Can we give it up for Sarah? Yes. So as Sarah just mentioned, we're talking about the National Housing Act of 1934 being discriminatory. Once again, we're talking about these practices where they were making it difficult for minorities to obtain loans. So as a way to, and with that was also the practice of white flight. So white individuals simply moving out of their neighborhoods, or leaving these neighborhoods very expeditiously and moving out into the suburban areas. So as a way to exacerbate and to expedite that process was the practice of block busting. If you are familiar or if you have read one of my favorite books, Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, in his research, which he has spent more than a decade studying, he has found in his research that real estate agents and real estate speculators were literally paying black and white real estate agents to go and pay black women to push their babies in their carriages in these racially transitioning neighborhoods, as well as paying black men to drive their cars and blast their ethnic music in these neighborhoods to further scare white homeowners into thinking that black people were moving into their communities. Because once again, the practice of redlining was more so saying that your skin tone, your race, your ethnicity is now going to depreciate my home value, and more importantly, you are now jeopardizing my ability to generate wealth and equity for myself, for my children, and so forth. So therefore, if you move into my neighborhood, I now have to leave and move away from you, essentially. So of course, real estate agents were using that to their advantage to further exacerbate that fear, and use it as a fear tactic essentially. So hey, we're going to pay you to move out of these neighborhoods. And of course, you also have the second one, which I want to allude to, which is contract buying slash land contracts. Is anyone familiar with those two terms? No problem. So contract buying slash land contracts, once again, as I mentioned before, minorities were not allowed to go to the banks and get approved mortgages. So instead, it was this buyer-seller contract. In other words, if I'm a white individual and Monica is selling me a house and she's a black woman, she will literally tell me like, hey, let's disregard the bank. Like, we're not going to deal with the bank. Because, of course, for obvious reasons, you cannot be approved for a mortgage. But instead, we're going to do this buyer-seller contract, and there are several caveats. One, you are going to pay rent. You're going to pay rent that is 2 to 3 times higher than like your neighbors. 2, the moment that you are late on a payment, I get to 1, strip you of all the equity that you have built towards that house or invested into that house, and 3, more importantly, I get to take the house from you. So in other words, the significance of the land contract slash contract buying was it literally forced individuals to have to stay in this neighborhood because they knew that the moment that they were late on any payment, they were going to lose everything that they've invested in. So this is why you have so many people saying like, oh, I have to live in this circumscribed neighborhood and stay here because you actually have to stay there or you will lose all that you invested in. So once again, I want to continue to emphasize that, despite in these circumscribed neighborhoods, these individuals were still forced to physically be there, even if they didn't want to be there. So of course, the last 2 that I want to talk about is planned shrinkage. So the 2 images that you see on the bottom of the screen is one, a dilapidated building in Mount Pleasant, and then of course the bottom right, you see an image of a dilapidated buildings in East Cleveland. And if you know either of those 2 neighborhoods, if you know Mount Pleasant as well as East Cleveland, you know that there are a lot of issues that are going on in those neighborhoods. But a lot of those issues also pertain to the history of redlining as well. So of course, particularly with planned shrinkage, when you are a homeowner, you are paying property taxes, and those property taxes are going towards your streets and sanitations, park and recreations, your police department, pretty much all of the amenities that you need in order to allow your community to thrive. But what happens when the city of Cleveland has a population of 1 million people and they're used to a $50 million budget to provide all of those resources to each and every part of the city? And then when white flight takes place and the population declines drastically, they now have to deal with the $1 million budget, but they still have the same geography that they have to provide those services to. So inevitably what happens is now we have to pick and choose what neighborhoods will in fact keep those resources and which ones will not. So of course, I think we all know which of those neighborhoods and which of those cities were stripped of those resources and which neighborhoods maintain those resources. And so essentially what you see in these 2 images, one is the dilapidated building, but more importantly, but also just more unfortunately, it's the tires in front of the building on the bottom right image, because it just shows you how these resources and amenities are unfortunately not being executed and done in these parts of the city. Then, of course, lastly, I talked about predatory banking. If you were to go to any red line or yellow lined area, you'll most likely not see a credit union. You will most likely not see, a banking institution. Instead, you'll most likely see your fast food restaurants, your McDonald's, your Wendy's, your payday loans, your rent centers, and the ramifications of those sort of things is that one, you're not allowing people to have the access to generate wealth, to have access to go to a bank and apply for a loan, but instead you're forcing them to pay an exorbitant APR rate towards a refrigerator. So you go to a renter center and you pay for a $500 fridge, but yet the APR and the interest rate is 55%. So and of course that's just repugnant. Like, you're paying 4 or 5 times over for this one item. So imagine, there is a reason why these particular businesses are thriving in these neighborhoods, because they know, because of redlining, that it's much easier to have these individuals fall victim to their business models and to their businesses, as opposed to giving them the necessary resources to thrive economically. Are there any questions? I know that was a lot. So yes. So the next question that I want to delve into is, what did the federal government say and do about this? So at this point, I'm going to make this interactive, because I'm losing my voice a little bit, and I also want us to, have some energy to talk about this. But I'm going to invite someone to come up here and read this highlighted section for the group. Anyone? I call on people.
Although the origin of the property value just to highlight it. The colored people certainly have a right to life, liberty, and to pursue profit. They must recognize the economic causes and forego their desire to split off the
Thank you so much. So once again, this is text literally created by the federal government, first and foremost. And so the question that I want to pose is, out of this entire thing, what is the takeaway that you get from this from the highlighted section? Anyone? Oh. Absolutely. So thank you. I'm sorry, what is your name? Caitlin. Can we get up for Caitlin? Yes. So out of this entire thing, out of the highlighted section, or from the highlighted section, I think the most profound statement or term that you can strip from this is economic disturbance. It was deemed an economic disturbance for a minority to live anywhere near or anywhere proximate to a white individual, because once again, your presence in my neighborhood is now jeopardizing me as a white individual from generating wealth for not only for myself but for my family and for my grandchildren and so forth. Yes. I was gonna. Yep. Yep. Absolutely not. And once again, this goes back to, I'm trying not to make it too casual, but once again, what you just emphasized is that we as the federal government, we have created these districts, we have created these enclaves and essentially circumscribed these districts for you. And once again, the moment that you leave the neighborhoods that we told you to stay in, we now have to use violence, we now have to use state-sponsored sanctions, we now have to use fear tactics to essentially make sure that you either stay in that neighborhood, or the moment that you leave the neighborhood we have given you, we now have to, it's just repugnant, we now have to scare you essentially and blow up your house. We now have to have people wear the KKK hoodies. We now have to have the burning of the crosses. And we now have to have the entire city of white individuals establishing mobs in your front porch to pretty much scare you, to say like, hey, you may be a physician. We may all just be coal mine workers here, but you feel like you are better than us because you are black. Therefore, we need to do all of these things to get you to move back into the districts that we have established for you and your people. And so once again, I know this is very doom and gloom, but this is the unfortunate reality of our country, and we have to address it. Once again, this is the year awareness building phase that we are very much in. Are there any questions pertaining? Yes. Yep. And so what? You also had a question, sir. I'm sorry.
And the black community wants. The problem is
I'm sorry, what was the last part of your question?
Why the problem is all
We're going to delve into this towards the end. That is a phenomenal question. So we're going to put a pin on that. Yes, thank you.
Question, the original definition indicated that it was illegal. At the time, it clearly wasn't illegal.
Yep.
Maybe 1960s,
Yep.
but not then.
Absolutely not. Which is why, yes. And that is very much the difference between the de jure versus de facto segregation. People tend to think that so when we're talking about like these sort of things such as redlining, people are like, oh, minorities chose to live in the ghettos. They chose to live in in these repugnant and inhumane, conditions. Like, no, when you actually go back and take the time to analyze our history, read resources such as Color of Law, you actually realize that it was in fact de jure segregation. It was in fact, although it was illegal, or it is illegal now, it was legal at the time, and we have to take the time to go back and analyze the true realities of our country. Like, there's a reason why each and every metropolitan area has, a successful, Jewish population. There's a reason why you can look at any metropolitan city and find a ghetto or see urban affordable housing or urban planning, like in different pockets, or you find these areas where there are just racially homogenous minorities living there, because once again it dates back to the practice of redlining and more. So yes, that's a great observation. Yes. That's a great question too. So, and I think that varies. So there have been times where, that's a great question. So now this gets into like phenotypes in terms of like your physical attributes. So like there were a ton of individuals that were black, but they came off as white, and so it was much easier for them to maneuver those systems. But I think the nuance is what happens when you are fair skinned and you are African American, but you are fair skinned, and you were able to go and essentially pass. But then your family members who may have a darker skin tone come and visit you for the holidays, and of course now your white neighbors are like, oh wait, no, my neighbor who I thought was white is actually black. And so we have to understand once again the nuances of what it means to be a homeowner and what that means for your family. Yes.
And I'm not sure when this stopped, but there was a period of time that if you had even 10% of black blood, you were considered black. So there was no mix.
Absolutely not.
In those days, you were white or black,
Yep.
and if you were mixed,
Yep.
then you were black. You
Yep.
took the
Black.
side.
Absolutely.
So if you were mixed in race at that time, you had to be with the black.
Yep. And so what Professor Stark is talking about is, I believe, from the New Jim Crow, as well as a series of other books, such as like the brown paper bag test, the 1%, which literally means if you have 1% of African American descendants in your blood, you are African American. Like, you could be 99% like Caucasian and 1% black, and they will say like you are black, because once again they deem black as a form of impurity. Like, you were not natural. You were the other. So even when you had 1%, we automatically have to attribute that 1% as an other for you. So yes, thank you. I love the questions. So once again, we're talking about not only the economic disturbance, but also the established districts that the federal government created due to de jure segregation. But I also want to emphasize how this continued to showcase itself or materialize due to the real estate industry. So we have something called the underwriting manual. The underwriting manual is pretty much this booklet with all these with a series of regulations and protocols that banking institutions and insurance companies pretty much had to follow if they wanted to continue to gain support by the federal government. And of course, some of the clauses, that were included in this booklet were of course repugnant. So in other words, you can have the 1939 Cleveland redlining map, as well as a series of repugnant and discriminatory regulations that you have to follow, that if you wanted to continue to have support by the federal government. And one of the things that I want to also emphasize is the National Association of Real Estate Brokers also took part in this practice as well. So, in other words, if you're a real estate agent, we're essentially giving you this book and saying, read this book and abide by this book. This is your Bible, essentially. So when you do your work, when you do your work, and someone approaches you and says, "Hey, I'm looking to buy a home," in other words, you're going to look at the 1939 redlining security map. And of course determine their ethnicity and race, then go and look at the security map and determine what areas or districts they could in fact buy a home, and then of course use very nefarious and sneaky tactics to encourage that individual to potentially buy a home in certain neighborhoods. And we see it to this day where real estate agents find ways to encourage certain individuals or steer them into certain areas versus other areas. So of course, once again, as I mentioned before, all of these systems are highly interconnected in more ways than one. So when we talk about education, when we talk about environmental science or environmental justice, or even environmental racism, digital redlining, violence, crime, lead, asthma, public health, essentially health, community organizing, wealth gap, mass incarceration, civic oppression, as well as a panoply of other systems, oftentimes we tend to study it just in those silos. So we can study the achievement gap and you instantly think, oh, it just relates to education. Oh, we can study the school to prison pipeline system and you solely think it relates to the criminal justice system. Oh, we can study public health and just think that we have to have that one paradigm of studying it within the realm of public health. Yes. I was going to get to that in a second. I'm glad that you mentioned that. Yeah, because a lot of people ask about that, which is very important. But all in all of these systems plus more are highly interconnected to our history. And there's a reason why these systems of inequities continue to showcase itself, and that is because of not only redlining, but as well as our history as a country and as a nation. So of course, if you ever get the opportunity to come by the exhibit, you will see these two very, very in-depth timelines. And both of these timelines are compartmentalized in 4 different eras: separate and unequal, more separate and more unequal, still separate and still unequal. And have we learned nothing? We have not, because once again, our history is just it's reoccurring. The top, yes. Yes, it is, and I can answer that at the end of the presentation. So the top timeline is pretty much your federal systems and institutions working in tandem to make sure that redlining continues to showcase itself, and if not redlining, then the remnants and the ramifications of redlining. I also want to emphasize that redlining was placed in its proper place in our history, which was 1938 or 1930s. I apologize, but of course, it is yet another iteration of the Great Depression, segregation, the Civil War, Jim Crow, and slavery, as you will see going towards the left. And then, of course, when you move to the right of the top timeline, you will see. I'm gonna move so I can get to the screen. And if you go to anywhere on the right of the timeline, you will see some, but not all, but a lot of the societal and economic issues that we are dealing with because of redlining. So you have, of course, redlining, blockbusting, white flight, racial covenants, which I will discuss in a second, which also connects to the GI Bill, displacement, urban decay, increasing segregation, planned shrinkage, the epidemics, the riots, the unraveled social fabric, which is very important pertaining to our history of redlining, because essentially what it did was it fragmented these very cohesive communities. Of course, you get back to planned shrinkage, even mass incarceration, trauma, generational trauma, which is just as important. Then, of course, the war on drugs, the broken windows, foreclosure, serious displacement, and then, of course, we could add so much more content. There's a lot of content that we could delve into. But the bottom timeline, these are your community organizing, your community activism, and grassroots efforts that took place as a result of everything from the top. So you have the federal as well as the federal institutions and systems working to make redlining happen. But at the bottom, you have your grassroots efforts and community organizers coming together and mobilizing to eradicate and to combat those issues. In other words, all of the success, all of the progress that we have made as a country did not come from the top down. It came from the bottom up. it came from the MLKs, and the Malcolm X's banding together to mobilize people to say, hey, we are demanding a better society, a better civil rights essentially for everyone. And that did not come from the federal government themselves, because otherwise they would have kept having Jim Crow laws to continue to be institutionalized. So of course, I encourage you, if you have the opportunity, to check out the exhibit and engage with these two timelines, because they are very in-depth. But the beauty of these two timelines is that they show you that all of these systems are truly, truly, truly interconnected in more ways than one. Are there any questions pertaining to anything from these two timelines? Okay. Thank you. So now, let's get to some of the Cleveland stories pertaining to redlining. So the first one that I want to talk about is the Shaker Heights barricades. Would someone like to read the Shaker Heights barricades for us? And if you cannot see it, I also have a copy of it here as well. I'm gonna give you the microphone.
All right. Something unusual happened in Shaker Heights in 1976 when what seemed to be temporary traffic barrels were placed across 6 streets blocking them. Shaker Heights claimed they were a traffic calming measure meant to avoid traffic buildup in the neighborhood, but little traffic had previously been reported. In the following years, the barriers became permanent, sitting along a dividing line between wealthier and whiter Shaker Heights and predominantly black surrounding neighborhoods. In the Lomond neighborhood of Shaker Heights, the 6 streets originally blocked were Scottsdale Boulevard at Lee, Avalon, Ingleside, and Warrensville Center roads, Ronsdale Road at Lomond Boulevard, and Kenyon Road just east of Lee Road. Many residents at the time feared the possibility of infiltration into Shaker Heights would lead to declining property values, blockbusting, and the total transition of the suburb. A court case against the barriers was struck down by the Ohio Supreme Court in 1987, solidifying the barriers as a legal means of division. Despite protests following the ruling, several of the barriers still exist today.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, what is your name? Pauline. Can we give it up for Pauline? So what did Pauline just read to us? I saw Professor Stark, I saw you reacting.
No, because I know that area. I've gone down North Street.
Yep.
I
So
know that's why that was there,
Yep.
but I've seen that in my own eyes. Wow.
Yep. So once again, I want to continue to emphasize that a lot of the experiences that we have, particularly with urban planning, is very intentional. Unfortunately, of course, they may not; those urban planners may not have had had good intentions at the time. Of course, this is the anomaly, but still, we have to address the unintended ramifications of those decisions nonetheless. So thank you. Yes. Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. So once again, the significance of this, of the Shaker Heights barricades, is talking about yet another tactic to build these physical barricades to separate the affluent part of Shaker Heights from the city of Cleveland's border. You can find so many examples, including like the 8 mile example, or no, it's not the 8 mile, the border in Detroit from 8 Mile, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, 8 Mile, that pretty much stated that a lot of the development that took place. A lot of the development that took place was not going to take place had they not included that barrier, because once again, or built that wall essentially, or built that wall, because essentially what it indicated was like, if you do not build that wall between the affluent parts of the city in those communities, then that essentially means that your home value will depreciate. So you have to literally build this physical barricade to separate the two communities. What I also want to emphasize too is you can look at any any city, even with myself from Chicago, look at any city and see once again the ways in which urban planners have also helped to fragment our cities in more ways than one. And one of the ways, of course, that I love to say is the significance of the Interstate Highway Act of 1954 and 56, which pretty much created our highway system as we know it. And if you look at any metropolitan city, you will see that the highways are deliberately fragmenting our cities. There's a reason why it is a little difficult to reach. You know, the Cleveland Heights, the Shaker Heights, the Beechwoods, the Pepper Pipes. Because once again, residents wanted to be ostracized. They did not want other people to have easy access into those communities. So if that meant stopping the 490 going east at East 55th in the city of Cleveland, when it was supposed to in fact go all the way to Cleveland Heights, if that meant stopping that highway within the city of Cleveland as a means of completely separating ourselves, then so be it. Because at least we can have our own community and thrive. So yes, that is the significance. Yes.
Not much Supreme Court is the Ohio Supreme Court of the U.S.
That is the Ohio Supreme Court. Yes. All right. Any other questions? So you're talking about the opportunity corridors and opportunity zones, which is great questions. I will circle back to those two developments towards the end. Just ask the question again towards the end, because those are great questions. Then, of course, the last story that I want to emphasize is which economic future. Would someone like to read this one for the group? Yeah. Yay. Here you go. Would you mind reading the first two paragraphs for us?
In Two Tomorrows, a report created by an Ohio-based organization, the Fund for Our Economic Future, racial disparities today in income, job opportunity, and wealth became a glaring takeaway. Even at the same levels of education, a white college graduate can expect to make 18% more than their black counterparts in the 1980s. This gap was only 10% in the 1980s. What we find is that across socioeconomic levels is that the gap between white and black earners in Northeast Ohio is actually increasing. According to the report, of the $69 billion earned each year in and around Cleveland, $58 billion is earned by white workers, while only $11 billion by workers of color. Other factors, including racial discrimination in hiring, result in an unemployment rate 3 times higher for communities of color in Cleveland. Meanwhile, the report points out that a lack of access to things like high-speed internet result effectively in digital redlining, even as this access becomes crucial to finding jobs and building skills in the tech industry. To close the growing gaps in employment and earnings will take more than what is currently being done, because there's little to no collective infrastructure to address the issue.
Thank you, Thagan. I'm sorry, what is your name? Rose, can we give it up for Rose? Thank you. And so what is it that Rose just read to us? A lot of great points. Also disheartening points as well. Anyone?
Well, we know about the gap between the gender gap,
Mm-hmm.
and we talk about that a lot in classes. But this isn't something that we talk a lot about, gap between races.
Yep.
Financially. And I think it's interesting to know, important for us to know, and think about for our students as future career people.
Absolutely.
How to make a difference.
Absolutely. So once again, thank you so much. So once again, this section highlighted a report called Our Two Tomorrows that was released by the Fund for Our Economic Future, and they pretty much conducted research and found out in and around Cleveland, $69 billion was generated. $59 billion of those $69 billion was generated by whites, and 11 billion was generated by blacks. So to Professor Stark's point, you're talking about the black-white racial wealth gap as well, and how it is increasingly widening, which is just also unfortunate. Sir, you also mentioned digital redlining. You asked about digital redlining. So the connection one, we all know that we all have computers in our back pockets, in our purses and bags, and with that, it is becoming increasingly difficult for people to have, to exercise their civic duty, register to vote, to be simply connected to the rest of the world if they do not have internet access. And the unfortunate reality is that areas that are historically redlined also don't have internet access. So instead, they are completely off the grid. So imagine if you're trying to apply to a job or for a job, and at this time they're like, "Oh, apply via Indeed or apply via LinkedIn." If you don't have high-speed internet, you can't do anything. Another example I love to emphasize pertaining to our education system is so many students have approached me, particularly through CMSD, stating that they type their papers, text their papers on their cell phones. And I'm like, wow, what do you mean you are texting on your phone to write your paper? So imagine if you are a teacher that don't understand the context of redlining as well as Cleveland, and this child lives in a digitally redlined community, and they have to write a 12-page paper and it's due by tomorrow. They now have to use their cell phones to do their research, but also use their cell phones to also type or text to type their paper. Now, if you are a teacher and if there are grammatical errors or if there are just so many errors in the paper, the thing that you're going to do is, of course, fail them or mark them, or they're going to get demerits. But once again, from that child perspective, even when they had all the resources, they had the iPads, they had the computers, they have the internet. The only issue, the major issue is that they don't have the high-speed internet to do the work. But now they have to be resourceful and use their cell phones, because at least their cell phone is quicker in terms of getting them information. So yes, from one end, you're talking about these structural barriers, but then at the other hand, you also have students being resilient and being very dynamic and traversing around these issues, and at the end still facing those ramifications nonetheless. Yes.
Okay, so what you're saying is that companies like Comcast, AT&T,
Yep.
Verizon, those companies, basically practicing.
Yep.
But what are their interests? They want to make money.
So there are several great documentaries. The first one is a digital divide on connectyourcommunity.com's website. AT&T was the company that got called out for literally practicing digital redlining. So you can literally be in parts of the city where the fiber nodes, so like the cables underground, one half the block is AT&T and the other half is Spectrum. It is literally that divisive. And yes, to your point about the return on your investment, so the ROI, it goes back to the same sentiments or the same philosophy behind redlining. A lot of these companies unfortunately believe that these historically redline communities are not going to pay their Spectrum bill or the AT&T bill. So what's the point in us investing into those communities if they're not going to pay us back? So but once again, which is just repugnant thought nonetheless. But at the same time, we also understand that internet access is a luxury, but nowadays is becoming a necessity. And the fact that a lot of companies are not trying to invest in these communities is just disheartening. 1 second, sorry, I saw a hand over here. Boom. Absolutely. Thank you. Mm-hmm. And especially students, you'll catch yourselves, or any of us will catch ourselves being in parts of the city or areas in which we're like, oh, I know my call is going to drop, or I know my text is not going to be sent, and that is because of digital redlining, unfortunately. Yes.
There was a story about a young man, or I don't know, it was a young man or a non-traditional student, but he had to go and sit outside of a Burger King, I believe it was,
Yep.
to do his work because they had internet connection inside the Burger King.
Yep.
Outside all night.
Yep.
To get his work done. He was that determined to get his degree.
Yep.
And that takes a lot of determination, but not everybody can do that, especially students who have children, little small children. If you had a bunch of little children, and if you were a single mom with those children, you couldn't carry all of those
Absolutely
children.
not.
Burger King is outside all night.
Absolutely not.
But
And
that's something that happened.
Yep. And it just shows you once again it just shows you once again how internet is once again a necessity in this day and age. Oh, so wait 1 second. I saw you had your hand up, sir.
This charge doesn't imply or doesn't mean
Mhm.
that they can't get internet in those neighborhoods.
No, so yes, great observation. So this is only a snippet of the article, so I can send you the resources that explains the definitions of that. And so that is a great observation how these are the areas with very little to no internet, but that does not mean that they do not have internet, which is a great observation. Thank you. Yes.
Essentially, my question was that is it a map showing where there's no company
Mhm.
mining in that area, or is it household?
Mhm. So these are very much the house. Yes, so these are very much the households with very minuscule, very minimum internet. But this then gets into the nuances and the science or the engineering of like fiber nodes and, DSL and stuff that I don't even know pertaining to like internet access. So yes, but that is great, phenomenal observations.
They're just problem is problems with
Yep. And that is the confounding variable between your two questions. It's, hey, more than 50% can have the internet within X census tract on the east side of the city. But now the question at hand is the speed. So once again, to my earlier point, I can have internet access if I live in this neighborhood. I can have my computer, but it will probably take me all night for the Google homepage to pop up. So at this point, if it takes the Google homepage to pop up, well, at this point, and I have a paper due in like 2 hours, I'm just going to grab my cell phone, which then gets into students and individuals like texting their papers and doing their research via their phones. So once again, we also talked about the racial wealth gap that I want to emphasize. A number of studies have been conducted that pretty much states that the black-white racial wealth gap is about $171,000 for whites versus 17,000 for blacks. And I also just wanted to show yet another image or graph by the Prosperity Now's report that talks about how essentially by 2043, the racial wealth for black individuals will hit $425 and will continue to increase to about $132,000 for whites. And the report also projected that the black net worth is projected, or wealth is projected to hit zero by 2050. So once again, emphasizing how because of the practices of redlining and more are causing African Americans and other minorities wealth to decrease, unfortunately, as juxtaposed to their white counterparts. There are a number of statistics that they have conducted. We can talk about the statistics, economics afterwards. But that is a phenomenal question. So yes, once again, I know that this is now doom and gloom. There's so much content that I've spewed off, and oftentimes when you're now at this point, people ask okay, what is it that we can do to kind of undesign the legacy of redlining? And of course, there are many ways you can do it. One of the ways that I love to talk about is acknowledging that it still exists. So I'm going to very quickly go through some superposition maps that shows you that, although redlining took place in the 1930s, it is still taking place today. And then we're also going to just wrap up talking about a little bit of civic engagement and plugging in to help eradicate redlining. So of course, these 5 maps that I'm about to show you pertain essentially to equity building, power shifting, and more importantly, the power of choice. What redlining did for a lot of minorities was strip them of these abilities. It stripped you of your ability to gain equity. It stripped you of your ability to have the power of choice, as well as to have any sort of power whatsoever. So, as I mentioned before, there are 5 maps that I'm going to show you that pretty much talks about that. And essentially, if you want to gain upward mobility, if you want to achieve the American dream, you have to have these 5 things. Because in other words, if an opportunity presents itself to you, you have to have these 5 amenities in order to seize it. Otherwise, you can't seize the opportunity. So of course, you have mobility, and you will see that the areas that are historically redlined and yellow-lined are also the areas or the census tracts with low mobility rates. You can say the same thing for health and well-being. Once again, the areas that are historically redlined and yellow-lined also are also unable to have very clear access to health care, as well as their health status may not be up to par to their counterparts in the yellow to the blue and green lined areas. And one thing I do want to emphasize too is that a lot of people are also questioning, when you look at Cleveland Clinic main campus, it is in a redlined area, which is so profound. So it's in this area. And so when you're talking about one of the world's most profound health institutions being literally in a redlined area and not providing services to those communities, it just shows you the health disparities that exist within that one neighborhood with itself. Yes.
When I went to visit the exhibit that day, there was an NPR.
Mhm.
That explained that Shaker versus the Woodhill Buckeye neighborhood that are like 2 miles
Yep.
apart, the 23-year age
Yep. Yep. So within what you said it.
metro clinic
Yep.
right in that Buckeye neighborhood.
So no, you're right. So what she's alluding to is a report that the Center for Our Community Solutions conducted that pretty much states that within Woodhill and Buckeye, within a 2-mile radius, there was a 2-year life expectancy difference. So like if you live in Shaker Heights, your life could be you can have a life expectancy at 60 years old. But if you were to live 2 miles, away from that neighborhood, your life expectancy could be 40 years old. So it just shows you, once again, redlining. It shows you the health disparities, the public health disparities, and more, and how it continues to affect us in more ways than one. Once again, education, the same neighborhoods that do not have high school attainment or completion are also the same areas that are also the same areas that are historically redlined and yellow-lined as well. And then lastly, economic security, the ability to have income, wealth, savings, poverty rate, and employment are yet highly correlated to the neighborhoods that are historically yellow-lined and red-lined as well. So of course, the significance of these 5 maps is to show you that, hey, redlining, although we tend to think it was a practice done in the 1930s, it is still taking place in so many ways in 2020. And of course, lastly, more importantly, the housing stability, hence why redlining was even practiced in the first place. Same neighborhoods that are redlined and yellow-lined are also the same neighborhoods where there's a low home ownership rate. I'm sorry? Oh yeah, just a little. Just very, taking a picture. So now, undoing the legacy of redlining, let's talk about a little bit of civic engagement. Is anyone familiar with the significance of the 2020 census? 2020 census is coming up very quickly. It will be happening the second week of March, and it pertains to a lot of resources that we get as a city, as a county, as a state, and as a country. But once again, we wanted to do some GIS mapping and show once again the correlation between neighborhoods that are hard to count. So the neighborhoods that do not tend to fill out the census also correlates to the neighborhoods that are redlined and yellow-lined. And so in other words, it's emphasizing the civic apathy that exists, unfortunately. Also want to talk about voting. So this is also another map of the 2018 voter turnout. And you will see that a lot of the same areas that are the dark red are also the same areas that are redlined and yellow-lined. So it shows you the civic apathy, once again, that unfortunately still exists in those communities. So once again, very quickly, if you're unfamiliar with the census, the census data is used for a multitude of reasons. First and foremost, pertaining to congressional representation. And then, of course, the data is also used for Medicaid, SNAP, Medicare, highways, streets and roads, Section 8, school district budgets, school lunches, foster care, and a panoply of other systems. And so the reason why I mentioned this as it pertains to redlining is because in our efforts to undesign the redline, we have to provide ways to find ways to plug into the civic process and to exercise our civic duties in order to help eradicate any and all forms of redlining and racism, unfortunately. Yes. Yeah. So, absolutely. So, the census is pretty much this very comprehensive decennial comprehensive survey that takes place every 10 years to count each and every person living in the country. Pretty much the U.S. Census Bureau utilizes that data to then do like statistical analysis and say, hey, due to the population within the state of Ohio, as well as the population in Cuyahoga County, we are going to allocate a portion of the $675 billion from the federal budget to the state of Ohio, and then more specifically, to Cuyahoga County, and then from there it is dispersed throughout our county. But particularly to some of these programs are they use population algorithms to determine how much money should be invested in those neighborhoods. So in other words, if they do not know that each and every person is in these neighborhoods, the ability to subsidize doctors' payments or doctors' services becomes increasingly difficult. And the same can be said for any of these programs. If there are in fact 10 million people in Cuyahoga County, but yet only 4 million of them get counted, that means that there was an undercount of 6 million people. So therefore, the U.S. Census and the federal government can only allocate, based upon the people that they know. So we have to be very cognizant and make sure that we are in fact counting ourselves, so that we can utilize all of the resources to the best of our advantage. And very quickly, oftentimes the number that people are spewing around to talk about the census and the undercount is, if you're undercounted, we are projected to lose anywhere from $1,800 to about $2,300 per person for the next 10 years. So in other words, if you're one person and you're undercounted, that's what, $18,000 that is being lost and being stripped from our county and from your neighborhood as well. Yes.
How come those neighborhoods are undercounted or older?
Absolutely.
How come they are high? If they're underprivileged and get this chance to prove, I'm going to wait in line to vote.
Absolutely.
To make sure that I'm counted. How come they're
Absolutely.
undercounted?
And that is a great question, and it varies amongst each and every individual. But we also have to acknowledge the historical and structural and institutionalized efforts that have taken place that resulted in individuals having that apathy. So in other words, people tend to say the government hasn't done anything for me. Why should I vote when I can go through the exhibit and find out that the government has been doing these things that hindered my grandparents or my great grandparents from being able to own a home? So in other words, why should I in fact vote? And so it's oftentimes it is this paradigm shift within that individual to say hey, don't have that apathy despite all of these historical and repugnant practices, but instead use this as a gateway, as a platform to help to combat these issues. And so yes, it varies. And when we talk about voting, when we're talking about census work or these communities, we tend to think that they are monolithic. We tend to think that we can say one thing to Monica and then go down the street and say the same exact thing to Devontae, and we're both gonna, feel empowered to exercise our civic duty. But it varies. It requires someone having to go to Monica and explain, how these resources influence and impacts her life that makes her want to go out and vote and make sure that she wants to complete the census, versus me, because once again we all have different passions and different viewpoints pertaining to our political system and to our government.
So basically, it's a question of education.
Absolutely.
And social engagement.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep.
Myths in the community.
Right, so
Debunking some of these myths. Some people have been told by grandparents and everything, don't do this
Yep.
because they may be, so especially immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they may believe that if they count themselves, that somebody's going to come and take people out of their homes,
Mm-hmm.
send them back to a place that they don't know anybody.
Yep.
That scare tactic that could be, who knows who could be scaring them, or maybe it could just be not totally understanding it. That's a scare tactic down for generation.
Absolutely.
Don't do it.
And this is the thing, and I'm glad that you mentioned that. It's I would rather trust my mom if my mom told me X, Y, and Z, versus a stranger who's tabling, trying to educate me on the actual, the more accurate information. It's about who you know, and once again, those trusted individuals. And this is a matter of us educating everyone and debunking those myths and making sure we are disabusing each and every individual who may in fact be a little ill-informed.
do you see improvement over time?
Mhm.
In the last 10 years?
I can't say.
Educators like you.
I can't say 10 years per se. I can definitely say in the last 2.5 years of this work, the civic muscle is definitely there. I think it's years, decades of us having to unravel and rebuild the historical. Rebuild those unfortunately fragmented communities and get them to understand, that you should see yourself in the civic process, and that there are ways that you can plug in besides, voting, besides running for office. Like there's a series of things you can do to in fact be civically engaged. So yes. And so very quickly, I just want to also talk about, two very important dates. You have the March 17th election as well as the census that is happening on April 1st. And of course, I'm going to send this to Professor Monica Stark as well, which is also this great 17-minute clip that talks about each and every chapter of Color of Law. And Richard Rothstein does a phenomenal job narrating of a lot of the information that I talked about and more. So with that said, did we have any? Yes. Yes, boom. Yes, thank you. And I was just like, where's the location? As of right now, we do have one of the exhibits available at Mount Pleasant Now Community Development Corporation. I can definitely be sure to follow up and provide that information pertaining to their open hours, as well as if you would like a private tour, which is a much more intimate engagement with the exhibit. So with that said, yes.
One challenge that I see moving forward is technology.
Mm-hmm.
We moved away from the city to our national.
Mm-hmm.
You're going on the internet, you're not seeing what's happening. You're seeing what's happening in
Yep.
Arizona.
Yep.
And I think that's an aspect of having a local internet space along with a global.
Absolutely.
See that
We are definitely working and now delving into the work of like digital advocacy work. I think on one hand, it is a little unfortunate when we're talking about voting or civic engagement or redlining. People tend to automatically think about like the citizenship question. You tend to immediately think about the 2016 election and the cybersecurity. So cybersecurity tend to be the number one topic when you're talking about digital advocacy within itself. And so it's us having to find very creative ways to, create these like safe platforms that have the necessary firewall and security to enhance essentially that trust. Because there's no point in me getting on Facebook, sharing my thoughts and my aspirations if it's only going to be utilized, elsewhere or, used to tier or, skew political parties and aspirations. But it's an ongoing thing, to be perfectly honest. The digital space is very complex. There's a lot to it. And so it's a matter of us having to have the acumen to understand it before trying to like encourage other people to begin using it accordingly and appropriately. So yes, thank you. Any other questions? Yes. Absolutely. So there is a great book that I also came across, A Terrible Thing to Waste, that talks about something called fence lining. Fence lining is yet another form of areas that are environmentally hazardous. Particularly in this book by Harriet A. Washington, she talks about lead poisoning, which is a major issue in the city of Cleveland. And in her book, she takes the time to talk about the neuropsychological and the neuropsychological implications of what happens when you have a dust of lead enter your body and the neurological like changes that takes place. Richard also talks about it too a little bit, but essentially what they're talking about is that there's a correlation between those who have been exposed to lead poison and lead essentially to violence. And once again, we tend to just think that, oh, this person is violent for this reason, when in fact it's a mental, it's a psychological, it's a neurological change that has taken place because of the environment that the federal government deliberately placed them in. So of course it's a matter of us not only acknowledging that, but giving them the necessary resources to combat that and those changes as well. But instead people just think like, oh, this person has ADHD, oh, this person is incapable of paying attention, oh, this person is violent, oh, this person is temperamental, when in fact it is environmental changes that have altered their homeostasis. So yeah, it's. Yep, it is crazy. Like you can look at like oh my God, what is it called? Urban heated like neighborhood, like areas. In other words, there's a huge correlation between areas that are historically redlined as well as those that have architecturally unstable houses, and of course that then results in neighborhoods being the heat is significantly higher than their like adjacent neighborhoods, and because of the heat that then results into like more violence and crimes taking place. So yeah, it's quite insane to understand the nuances and the correlations and intersections of redlining. Yes.
Well, if I could just say one sociological
Oh yes.
aspect of why some of these crimes happen. Look at something called the structural strain theory. And it has to do with the gap between what people are interested in having, like the American dream, and the means that it takes to get there. Basically, what the structural strain theory is saying is that everybody wants to live in the American dream. Doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. We all want to live it because we all hear about it. It's forced into our psyches, right? But some of us have the ability to live the American dream, and some of us don't.
Yep.
For those of us who don't, we go by whatever means possible to live. I still want to drive a nice car. I still want to live in a fancy house, even though I'm poor. And if I can't get it the way that I'm supposed to get it, then I go out here and I do crazy things.
Yep.
Commit crimes to get it, because that desire to have what I see on TV and what everybody else has, that lives in me. So that structural strain theory is kind of saying that people are committing crimes sometimes because society tells us you gotta have this. You need to have this. And we're not looking at everybody can't have it.
Yep.
So, that could be an issue. And then so if you live in a household with family that has been dealing with this structural strain theory, your dad, your uncles, they committed crimes to get things. I've grown up watching people commit crimes to get what they want. Wow, I gotta go to work. I'm gonna do what my uncle and my dad did to get what I want. So then there's a generational issue.
Absolutely.
Of committing crimes and doing things like that, because I'm getting to the point where I don't really, I know right from wrong, I definitely do, but I don't care about right and wrong. I just care about what I want.
And so what you're also
It's hard to change that around.
And what you're also talking about is the underground economy. As I love to say, like, but with the underground economy, there are still, if even I try to do everything right, there are still jobs to be had and money to be made. It may just be it may be illegal, but I still have to put food on the table. I still have to take care of my family. And so now this gets into the mass incarceration, because once again, you're now talking about individuals doing these illegal means to make ends meet. If you are familiar with the Maslow hierarchy of needs, the bottom of it is basic necessities: safety, food, security, homes. And those who are red line to yellow line, you are at the bottom of that pyramid. But when you are in the blue or green line area, you can think about the apogee, which is self-actualization. You can think about being civically engaged and attending forums and keeping your elected officials accountable, because you already have all of the means to secure and the security and the stability. Already. So we have to continue to acknowledge that very stark dichotomy within our cities and within our nation. So yes, but with that said, thank you so much. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions.